Hello, my name is Sarah Omar, and I'm an assistant professor in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you to our series where you get to meet scholars and hear them discuss their intellectual journeys. My guest today is Dr. Asma Afsaruddin, professor at Indiana University, Bloomington. Dr. Afsaruddin, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this invitation to take part in this conversation.
So I'd like to have you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to your areas of research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, my big moment of epiphany occurred when I was an undergraduate at Oberlin College in Ohio. I had declared a major in government, as they used to call the program at that time. Since then, they've renamed it political science. But I was majoring in government with a focus on comparative politics and international politics. And my regional specialization was actually in the Middle East. You have to realize that, of course, very young. But at that time, the Middle East was very much in the air. It was right after the Iranian Revolution under Khomeini. So, you turned on the evening news, it was all about Iran, it was all about the Middle East. And, in general, to this day, American people are not very good at distinguishing between different groups of Middle Easterners or different groups of Muslims. So all of that became conflated together, right? So you heard the words interchangeably between Arabs, Iranians, Muslims, and so forth. But that certainly generated an interest in me for focusing on the modern Middle East and focusing particularly on Middle Eastern politics. So I was advised by my advisor at the time that if I were to go down that track, particularly for graduate work, then I should take a course on economics, and particularly economics that focused on oil revenues. And the importance of oil, of course, in the Middle Eastern context was obvious at the time. And so I decided, well, all right, to beef up my credentials for graduate school, I should definitely enroll in a course on economics. And boy, did I loathe that course. I simply did not derive any enjoyment from sitting through what I consider to be a very tedious course on economic theory and so forth. So it occurred to me that maybe I should revisit my plans for focusing on modern Middle Eastern politics. Now, in my sophomore, I think in my junior year, a turn of events occurred that changed the trajectory of my research. Oberlin hired a visiting professor from Ohio State University by the name of Frederick Kaddoura, in Arabic, Farid Kaddoura, a Palestinian-American, wonderful gentleman, gifted teacher, full of information about the Middle East. He started teaching courses on classical Arabic and offered courses on Middle Eastern history and culture, with a focus also on the pre-modern period. And when I started taking these courses, I realized that I was really more interested in the pre-modern period, that my real love was for the history of the region, learning about Islam, learning about the culture and the deep roots of the culture in the past. So I still remain therefore interested in the Middle East, but my temporal focus changed. And I decided that I would apply to graduate programs focusing on classical Arabic and Islam. So when I started applying for graduate school, I was accepted by Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. So I joined the Department of Near Eastern Studies, and I worked with Professor Georg Krotkov, who was a specialist in Arabic philology and Semitic philology. I also had the very good fortune to take courses with Professor Majid Khadouri, who taught at that time at SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies, which is a branch campus of Johns Hopkins. So I studied with him Islamic political thought and Islamic law. And he had actually already by that time written a wonderful book on war and peace in Islam. That was a book that made a strong impression on me, because then I would go on to write later on a book on what I called Striving in the Path of God, that focuses on the development of the notions of warfare and peacemaking within the Islamic tradition. When it came time for me to pick a topic for my doctoral dissertation, Professor Krotkov suggested that I look at a manuscript, that an unpublished manuscript of which he had a microfilm that he had picked up while he was teaching at the University of Baghdad in Iraq. And interestingly, a former student of his had focused on a very important early political treatise by the name of Risalat al-Uthmaniyya, written by the famous belle-lettriste Al-Jahiz. Jahiz died in 869, so it was kind of at the peak of the 3rd, 9th century, when there were a lot of debates going on about legitimate leadership, and there were constant exchanges between Sunni and Shia scholars about the legitimacy of their various positions. So Al-Jahiz wrote from sort of the classical Sunni position, and he lays out in a very detailed manner the arguments for supporting the election of Abu Bakr after the death of the Prophet. So what Professor Krodkov had a copy of was a detailed Shia refutation of the Risalat al-Uthmaniyya, written by a scholar by the name of Ahmed ibn Tawus from Hilla in Iraq, who died in the 13th century of the Common Era. And he wrote a point-by-point refutation of the Risalat al-Uthmaniyya. And I took a look at the manuscript and immediately fell in love with the topic. This brought to the fore my interest in political thought, and particularly for the classical period. So that's what launched the writing of my first book. I got my PhD based on this dissertation where I compared Al-Jahiz's work with Ibn Tawus. But in the process, I learned so much because, you don't just look at two texts, obviously. I had to read around it, and I had to bring in a number of other fascinating works and scholars. So it really instilled in me a very deep regard for doing research on this grand scale. So after getting my PhD from Hopkins, I got my first teaching position at Harvard as a lecturer in Arabic. And I think, Sarah, your background is also at Harvard. So you remember, of course, Widener Library, right? With a huge treasure trove of books on absolutely abstruse topics. And they had like every Shiite work imaginable. So while I was there for 3 years, I was able to complete my complete the revised version of the dissertation in order to prepare it for publication. And every book that I wanted to read on that topic, particularly from the Shiite perspective, was at Widener. So it really speeded up my research. It was a wonderful opportunity to be able to also discuss many of the findings from these sources with very genial colleagues there. It was a very congenial intellectual home, if you like. So after my 3-year stint as a lecturer at Harvard, I got my first tenure track position at the University of Notre Dame. So I moved from Cambridge, Massachusetts to South Bend, Indiana. And Notre Dame actually had a generous leave policy for tenure track junior faculty. And so I qualified for one of these leaves at the end of my 3rd year of teaching there. And I had this opportunity to go over to Cairo. And I was able to work at the Dar al-Kutub al-Masriya, which is the premier library for unpublished manuscripts on a host of topics related to my field. And I had gotten very interested in a particular literary genre called Fada'il. Fada'il refers to praise literature, which praises the excellences of many different things, of cities, of people. But for the kind of work I was doing, where I was comparing Sunni and Shia views on who can be considered the most qualified leader of the community, what are the qualities that they all must possess? What sets apart, say, Abu Bakr from Ali? This was the constant motif of all these works, right? I mean, what are the distinctive features of these contenders for the caliphate? What sets them apart? What confers legitimacy on their rule? And a lot of the answers actually can be gleaned from this particular literary genre, the Fadail al-Sahaba literature that talked about the personal merits and moral excellences of the companions of the Prophet. So a lot of the answers were to be had in this particular literary genre, but some of the very early works had not been published yet. But Dar al-Kutub al-Masri had a number of critical manuscripts that helped me to flesh out the picture for the early period. As you know, there is an issue with not having, prolific sources for the early period. So whatever you can lay your hands on, I mean, that's a huge, I think, jump forward in our knowledge of the past. So that helped me to finish the book, finish the writing of the book, and earn tenure on the basis of that. Then 9/11 happened while I was still teaching at Notre Dame. And of course, you're way too young to remember this, but for those of us who were already in the field, this is a huge watershed, an enormously challenging period for us, right? And it encouraged us to think about how to present our scholarship in an accessible manner to a broader reading public, not just for the 10, 20 specialists in our field, right, who are more likely to read our densely written books. So One World Publications, based in Oxford, England, got in touch with me and asked me if I would be interested in writing, I guess what would eventually might be considered as a textbook, written for a broader public. And using a lot of the information that was in my first book, The Excellence in Precedence, Medieval Islamic Discourse on Legitimate Leadership, to be able to take all that information, present that to a broader public in a much more accessible way. And I jumped on the idea because I thought, this is a way of making our scholarship useful. After 9/11, many of us felt the obligation, despite the fact that we were not at all used to speaking in public in such fora. Many of us felt obligated, however, to assume the role of public intellectuals to a certain degree or another. And many of us were getting invited by the media, by community organizations. The local Rotary Club in South Bend, for example, got in touch with me many times, and I was actually happy to take part in their meetings. And I would get wonderful questions from the audience. And one of the comments or observations that would often come from the audience was that, they often don't trust what the mainstream media was saying. Certainly, internet sources were to be viewed with skepticism, and they were hungry for reliable knowledge coming from specialists, but they often couldn't read some of the scholarly stuff that we put out. And so that encouraged me to take on this project. So the First Muslims, History and Memory was written to reach, this kind of non-specialist audience. It did attract quite a bit of attention. And I was actually pleasantly surprised that the book was reviewed in the Washington Post and the Times Higher Education periodical. And it seemed like that this larger message maybe could be rendered much more accessible for an interested public. So, but 9/11 was another occasion for me to start thinking about issues of violence. To this day, of course, Muslims are often accused of being intrinsically violent, that there's something essentially violent within Islam, right? And so that got me thinking about, how does one, because you give public talks and inevitably that's one of the first questions you would get from the audience. Why are Muslims so violent? And why do they not denounce violence? What is it within Islam that makes Muslims so violent? So I thought maybe it's time to undertake a historical study of the term jihad, starting from the Quran, looking at the foundational religious text, but then going on to look at the historical texts and so forth. So my third monograph was published in 2013. It took about 8 years to read through various sources and do my research, and then get the book eventually published. And it came out under the title of Striving in the Path of God, Jihad and Martyrdom in Islamic Thought. And again, it's in many ways a typical academic book. It's full of very close readings of texts. There's a lot of Arabic that's thrown in there, and in many ways inaccessible to a larger public. And so I am currently writing a much more, I don't want to say popular version, because that, of course, has different connotations, but a much more layperson's version of the book for Oxford. It's part of their What Everyone Needs to Know series. So it's called Jihad, What Everyone Needs to Know. I'm taking a lot of the information there, but simplifying it and rendering them, much more absorbable, more readily absorbable by, sort of a very average, intelligent person, but not necessarily a specialist in our field. So I think that maybe in a nutshell explains why I have gone down the particular research trajectory that I have over the years.
Well, Dr. Afsaruddin, thank you so much for sharing your intellectual journey and for spending this time with us. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.